Hi, welcome to another episode of Deep Learning with PolyAI. My name's Laura. I'm in product marketing at PolyAI, and I'm joined CEO and co-founder Nikola. So we're going to be talking about a few myths of generative AI, and I'm going to start with a very spicy headline that come out recently from Gartner. So they've made a prediction that by 2027, a company's generative AI chatbot will directly lead to the death of a customer from bad information it provides. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's a real concern that could actually
Mm,
happen?
I think it's really good clickbait. I think that, that title probably got them exactly what they wanted, which was more traffic, right? Um, Look, I think that like all technology has risks, right? Man invented fire and many have died, in fires, right? It doesn't mean that it didn't lead to the advancement of civilization and better lives overall, right? Same is true for knives, for, for cars, for all sorts of technology, right? So to say something like that is scaremongering, and badly used technology can have negative consequences. And could it have a fatal outcome? Well, there's a lot of us, so highly improbable things can still happen occasionally, right? Has it happened already? Like, did a set of unforeseen circumstances and use of one thing or another lead to someone's death? Perhaps, right? Like, there's nothing Gen AI specific that makes this a technology that cannot be controlled and do well. I think that it's about who is responsible? Well, like the one who implemented it, who didn't test it. Could it be an inadvertent accident? Have people died from bad advice they received from a customer service representative? Well, probably, right? I think that claim is as true as the one they made, right? And it's kind of like when we see an accident from like a car that is autonomous, right? We pay a lot of attention because sometimes it's different from the kind of accident that would happen if a human drove that car. And yet, 250,000 people die every year on Chinese roads. And I think the math is pretty clear around like if we had fully autonomous roads and we implemented them there, like we probably have fewer deaths, right? And the remaining ones that would be fewer would still be caused by AI, right? So like did AI cause those, I don't know, 100,000 deaths instead of the 250,000? Like it's still fewer. And I think like, playing God and, the classical question of like, what should a car do if it's like, about to hit someone, but, on the other side, there's like a different group of people and how it should behave. These are like more dilemmas that have no right answer. But I think we will be using this technology because the advantages far exceeds the disadvantages, right? There's a lot of potential. We'll use them. And are we going to get something wrong? Yeah, for sure.
Mm. It's a very interesting topic. So I have been talking to a lot of our prospects at PolyAI. So I've been hearing their concerns that they're bringing to us and asking us about generative AI. So one of them, I don't know if you've heard about the Air Canada lawsuit that has just been ruled not in their favor. So they lost that lawsuit. So what happened? Now I just want to make sure I get the information correct. So there was a customer that had already traveled for a bereavement for a funeral, I believe, and then they talked to the chatbot. The chatbot said, "Even if you've already traveled, you can claim that back. That's fine." That's not correct. So the customer sued Air Canada and has won. Air Canada is trying to say um, its its representatives, including its chatbot, they do not represent the company, and the company cannot be held reliable for what they've said. Um, so now the company that we're talking to and selling our product to is nervous about this. So how would you respond to that?
I mean, look, I think companies are trying to weasel a lot of promises made by their representatives, automated or not, for like an eternity, right? And it's just, um, it's going to continue to happen. I think this is just a mishap. Should they be held responsible? I don't know, right? Like, I mean, feels to me like the court did the right thing, right? Which this person acted and incurred a loss because of information they received. If it's all documented and clear, I think that it makes sense that they bear some legal responsibility. It's not even about AI. It could have been a website which reads falsely or is, depending on the context to interpret, right? So, um, I think, we're getting like a lot of speculation right now where people think that, hallucinations will explode and these systems be saying completely random things. And um, I encourage all of those people to play with ChatGPT on their own and just see how it works. I think that, you don't trust everything you see on the internet, right? I think you could have very easily gone 30 years in the past and said, it's terrible. People read a lot of false information. The truth is now you're just kind of like very skeptical about everything you read. And I don't know if I think it's fine. I think that you will have these situations the same way you did with like the web. And I don't think it's a particularly big concern because you can make these things precise and you should design them so where you put in the knowledge base. But the real problem here is just like, the source of truth. And it's organizational. If you have all the information for a human, like it won't be that difficult to get it to work with a generative AI system. Now, if you have something that's off in the database and you don't specify it and you're not clear enough, you can confuse someone and maybe you'll be held responsible. And that's the cost of doing business.
Mhm. So another one of our concerns that I've heard is a customer who is worried that if one of their customers calls up and says, "I have a problem with products," the generative AI chatbot will go and look on sources like Reddit or reviews or things like that and find other people who've had the problem and come back and say, "You're right. There is a problem with this product. We've seen it before." Um, what do you think of that? Do you think that's a real issue?
Is there a problem with the product? I mean, I don't know, right? Like the whole kind of like scraping and gathering information from that, like this, you know, the reason that like RAG is used, retrieval augmented generation, is that the complexity of application design largely moves to, again, like pointing the LLM to the right source of truth, right? So if you have nowhere better to point your agents or your AI than Reddit to find answers to questions about your products, then you're probably going to be in trouble because you can find all sorts of things on Reddit. And I don't think you really want to use it as your source of truth. Um, so yeah, I think that basically you have to design the application in the right way. And I don't think that's a problem. The interesting thing is just when you get into situations that are unexpected. These systems tend to be very strong and precise. You can always misconstrue, um, you know, what the system said if you want to, kind of like act skeptical, and you might genuinely be confused as well sometimes. And I think that's about user experience and design and how you answer questions, what style. Uh, you know, the real problem comes when people ask something completely unexpected, right? That's where the fact that these systems have been trained on so much data basically puts you in situations where they might even know the answer, right? If we were talking about the history of, I don't know, the Rosewood Hotel in London, right? And you said, hey, the hotel like built, right? The system might just start telling you about like late Victorian architecture in London. And it'll be true, right? Maybe you didn't intend that to happen. But when prompting and building these things, you inform them what you want to do. But I think it becomes quite important to inform them what not to do as well, right? So there's kind of like the positives and the negatives that you need to provide so that you create the guardrails around how the system will behave. When you over constrain it, then you get things that don't work that well and you lose a lot of that flair, right? Around um, what LLMs can actually do. But if you don't constrain it at all, then you might get completely random questions, right? Because if you're not even, you can kind of like take the whole thing on a long discursive narrative. And in the end, you're talking about something completely unrelated. Now, we build systems, um, fully generative ones, which still have um, a a meta level control flow over them that kind of like dictates the world of what's possible or what's not possible in a given part of the conversation. And that like problem of dialogue management, right? And kind of like having a notion of like, hey, where am I in the conversation? What is the right source of truth? If I'm answering questions about, I don't know, flight policies, that's different from the part of the conversation where I'm rebooking travel, right? So, I think you just have to clearly define like what is in um, your knowledge base and where you perform function calls, what you do with them. But if you do it well and you test the system robustly, I think it's going to be pretty hard to get really extreme examples of generative systems misbehaving in ways that people fear.
Sure. So on that topic, I'm going to bring up another spicy thing that's happened with Google Gemini.
Uh,
So Google rebranded Bard to Gemini. That just started out, and then they had a pretty big mishap when they were changing users' prompts in the back end um, before it was to the system. So it was producing images that were fairly problematic. Um, yeah, so that's just happened recently. Um, how are companies still getting it wrong? Like I'm actually not entirely sure what their QA processes are and what their testing processes are.
I think it's really hard to release a product like this because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, right? So I think the example that really got um, people riled up was um, there was a query around um, generate a photo of 1943 German soldiers who were then drawn. They were very, very diverse, multiracial, and not really historically accurate. So I think they really backpedaled there. I think, it's from a position of care for like, the world that they probably have filters around, problematic here in the context where you probably don't want to have your tool used to generate that kind of stuff. But they try to filter it and kind of like, diversity and, create a non-problematic thing. And in it, they almost created something that was comical, right? And they backpedaled really, really quickly, right? Um, and they're really trying to control how people use it more so than like what it does. I think with OpenAI, you see a lot more of just like flat out like refusal to do this. I mean, I get annoyed by OpenAI all the time when I kind of say like I was trying to generate an image where Paddington and Winnie Pooh were eating hot pot, right? And it's like I cannot generate, like trademark, blah 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 blah, right? So you go like, can I at least just generate two bears eating hot pot? Like, okay, fine. But I think they control it at just like flat out, like I'll refuse. I think what Google tried is basically a UX thing, right? If you think about how they're coming well, they're behind OpenAI, right? Like, what if maybe they could make users like me happier, but just like generating things, but they'll change it up so it's not problematic, right? And in that filter, they just didn't really expect this, right? Um, I don't think we can laugh at them and be like, hey, they got it wrong, right? I think it's just like they're the challenger now, which I think is a very, very interesting place for Google to be because, they were and are still like a leading company. And I think they're a bit confused, right? Like, it's kind of like challenger came in, knocked them out. They're coming in for a rematch. Their confidence is shaken. They're doing like, things that they're not very used to doing. And, these things happen. I think, you know, we'll see how they bounce again, how they rebrand and what they do with the whole thing. But, it's interesting, right? Because you definitely want to control, on the other side of the spectrum, you've got Elon and X and, you've got Mistral, which is also a lot less filtered, right? I think that's probably the better approach. But equally, they're catering to really wide audiences. So I think like it's really hard to fit the specific needs of all those different personas and create a thing that people won't construe as offensive or, comically constrained or, like something that looks like it's just like nannying you and changing the way you behave. It's basically an adult filter that they try to add, right? Except their filter like put rose tinted glasses on problematic content. And That's just okay. Like mistakes. So what? Like, let's move on.
Yeah, yeah, it gets into a tricky censorship topic there if you go too far into it. Um, when companies make these mistakes, so Google's made this misstep. We've talked on the podcast before about DPD. One of their customers got the chatbot to write a haiku that criticized them. There's been a few others like the Air Canada one I spoke about before. Um, what do you think that does, like, to the general confidence of the public about generative AI and using it? Do you think people are still excited about it, or is it worrying people more?
I think we're in a bubble where we care a lot, so it's really hard for us to say. Like we're very sensitive to it either way, right? Um, I don't. I mean, I don't think so because I think the what we're putting out at scale with these things, the number of like really good experiences and things that people couldn't even imagine doing before, that's happening, I think far outweighs these examples. Of course, these examples are like sensationalist, and I think they'll probably lead to slower adoption in some industries that are a bit more risk averse. But like that's always been the case with any technology, right? Machine learning is not like a new thing, right? We've had probabilistic systems that work or not work in specific situations. These ones are there's a bit more autopilot in them. So, at the end of the day, it comes down to legislation. I don't think anyone's really going after, well, I mean, there's the EU AI Act, but we'll see how that plays out. As long as, the planet is not aligned around doing it, and most countries are not, I don't think we have much to worry about. I think we'll make a lot of progress.
Mhm. Okay, so if we can get to some advice that you would give. So if a company is looking to implement generative AI, what should they be looking for? So if they're partnering with a third party like ourselves, what are the questions that they should be asking, or the things that they should be looking for that this company offers?
Yeah. I think, you know, in our case, it's really about like how do you do behavior testing? How do you safeguard around things? Like what is the process all the way from, like unit tests to, jungle testing and like, just like how do you red team the whole solution, right? And just like try to break it in as many ways. And they should try to do it themselves, right? I think what's funny about a lot of these problems is I think you could have figured it out on your own relatively quickly, right? So I think, the other questions go a bit deeper, right? It's like, what do those companies actually do with your data? How do they use your data? Who are they sharing it with? But these are questions that like, you know, your DPO, your data protection officer is already asking regardless, right? And your IT teams and stuff. Um, so yeah, I think it's like, the level of usage and self-serve that you're going to have relative to, others. It really depends on what you're deploying Gen AI for. It's a general thing, right?
Mhm. We've deployed our product in incredibly regulated industries with really big companies. So what are the things that our teams have done to make them, like, to prove that risk mitigation before they push that out to their thousands of callers a day?
Yes. So I mean, I think like, you have to do a fair amount of like just like educating yourself around how these things work, right? So for like a heavily regulated enterprise, what tends to be pretty good fail-safe is implementing a system that doesn't do freeform response generation, but is instead kept to responding with one of a number. And the number can be high, 10,000 different responses to things, right? But, if you have like legal language around how you have to communicate a message, then you don't let the language model freestyle because, an and an or can have like very different implications and you might be held accountable. And then you have Air Canada, right? So I think there it's just important to kind of like maybe when you produce outputs, to kind of like have complete self-contained things. It's a bit, and you've been in phone calls with people where they're like, "Hey, look, legally, I have to like read you this," and then they start reading, and you're like, "What?" But that's the law, and like you have to implement systems that will do the same thing. So in regulated industries, you freestyle a bit less. That also means that the product iterations are slower, right? But it doesn't mean that they have to be slow, right? Because I think companies, we work with some very large enterprises, utilities, banks, where, they've been on the frontier of applying these things. And, we've tested it thoroughly. We've created behavior that is never off brand. It's never freestyling. And yet it's very flexible and versatile. So it can be done. There are a lot of pieces to it.
Mhm. Great. Great. I think that's all the questions that I have for you today. So thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Nicola. And we will see everyone next week.